Hello, everyone. I'm Diana Picon Manyari. I am the International Climate Director at Healthcare Without Harm. And joining me today to unpack and share with me the valuable insights and knowledge of the 58th meeting of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC's subsidiary body, the 58th meeting of the subsidiary body, are two colleagues who were on the ground. First off is Tebbe, the Environment and Resources Ph.D. student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and who also represented Healthcare Without Harm on the ground, as well as Jess Beagley, the policy lead at the Global Climate and Health Alliance. Thank you both for joining me today. And if you're ready, we can dive in. First off, Jess, maybe you can share with us one or two outcomes of SB58 in the health and climate space as we prepare for the Conference of Parties in December.
Thank you so much, Diana. And I think the first thing to say is that we didn't see nearly the level of progress that was needed at SB58 in Bonn. Partly this was because the agenda wasn't actually adopted until the penultimate day, even though it was a 2-week meeting. It took that long to even agree the agenda. And there were two things that really held up the adoption of that agenda. The biggest being finance and the long-standing commitment of developed countries to provide $100 billion annually by 2020 to developing countries to enable mitigation and adaptation has not been delivered. There are a number of developing countries that are rightly deeply disappointed in that situation, and therefore mitigation is being used by some parties as a bargaining chip. And they are really expressing their frustrations by saying that until finance is delivered, that they don't want to have discussions on mitigation because they know that that is such a key priority of developed countries right now. So lots of tensions at the intersection of finance and mitigation, but also to say that there are additional parties that are also reluctant to discuss mitigation because they have very strong vested interests, whether because they get high revenues from fossil fuels or from industrialized agriculture or from other sectors. They would prefer not to have specific discussions on mitigation. So in the agenda that was finally adopted, there was no mention of the mitigation work program, which is the only agenda item that focuses on emissions reductions. So that was deeply, deeply disappointing to see, but also really relevant to think about as we prepare for COP28 and how those problems can be addressed. The good news, though, that came out of SB58 was progress made on the first ever UNFCCC United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change conflict of interest policy. And we've seen in the past that there has been really high participation from fossil fuel industry representatives at COP. At COP26, the fossil fuel industry actually had representatives that totaled a delegation that was bigger than that of any individual country. And at COP27, the number of fossil fuel industry representatives that was present was even higher. We'd never see this in an international negotiation on tobacco. Just as an example, there's really strong policy principles on tobacco that say that the tobacco industry has no role in tobacco policy making. So it's a real juxtaposition when we look at the COP space, the UNFCCC space. But the progress that was made was that delegates from non-parties that are attending COP28 won't be able to hide behind the affiliation of what their badge says, the delegation that they are ostensibly traveling to COP on, but rather they'll have to disclose who pays their salary, what their day job is, and any affiliations that they have in that regard. So that'll be a real step forward in enabling other delegates to identify who might have especially strong vested interests on a certain topic. Thanks so much.
That's amazing, and certainly progress in terms of transparency, even with the backdrop of some of the disappointments that you mentioned earlier. So we know health is not a particular body of work for the UNFCCC. We know that we have a health day coming up, though, at COP28. So I wonder if both of you can tell me, how was the interconnection between health and climate change addressed during SB58? And why do you think it was covered this way?
Yeah, I can start here. And thanks for having this conversation with us. One thing that I was following very closely was something called the global stocktake, which is a big fancy word for a report card on the Paris Agreement. Essentially, we're trying to see how well we're doing on, achieving the goal set out in the Paris Agreement to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And this global stocktake was the third kind of technical dialogue, as they call it, basically trying to consume as much information as possible, both from parties on what they think, and then also from observer organizations like Healthcare Without Harm, and just trying to understand where everybody is thinking of how well we're doing on the Paris Agreement. And this third technical dialogue that happened at SB58 included 4 roundtables, and they were essentially just 3-hour sessions where you sit down and you listen to parties and organizations have time to speak and make statements on what they think about the topic of that roundtable. So there was a mitigation roundtable, for example, and so several parties, which I think is very positive for health, mentioned health co-benefits that should be included in this, in the mitigation roundtable, but also ultimately in the global stocktakes report. And that was really great to hear. Heard a lot about, reduced air pollution, resilient health systems. These are things that haven't necessarily been front and center normally in these international negotiations, but it was really great to see that in the global stocktake. And two, I'd also just mention health co-benefits was one thing, but also just co-benefits in general. So from a health perspective, if people are already talking about co-benefits, I think that's an easy way that we can kind of integrate health into that. But that's from the global stocktake perspective.
Thank you, Nova. That's really amazing. And obviously seeing how health is going to come into the articulation of all of these issues, benefits, co-benefits, and the issues surrounding public health. It's amazing to see. Jess, what can you tell us too?
Thanks, Diana. I'll pick up on a different negotiation process, and that's the one on the global goal on adaptation. So the global goal on adaptation is actually buried in the Paris Agreement. When we hear about the Paris Agreement, we hear about the 1.52 degree mitigation target, but there is also a global goal on adaptation that's referred to in the Paris Agreement. Despite the fact that the Paris Agreement dates back to 2015, we still haven't figured out exactly what the global goal on adaptation is and what it means in practice. So the work that's ongoing in the UNFCCC space right now is to figure out what that goal is and how we measure progress towards it. And something exciting for health that came out of COP27 was that health was identified as a theme in the framework that would eventually be established on the global goal on adaptation. And we saw that starting to come through in Bonn at SB58. So there was a text for negotiation or consultation that was released partway through the meeting in Bonn, and it referred to health content in the context of the global goal on adaptation that really drew from some leadership by AOSIS in framing the global goal on adaptation in terms of health and well-being. AOSIS is the Alliance of Small Island Developing States. So they really see the health impacts of climate change firsthand and what that means for people's lives. So that health and well-being framing is something that we as the health community both really want to support, but also help to flesh out. There were some health metrics that were mentioned that could support measurement of progress towards this global goal on adaptation once it's defined. Some of those included resilient health systems. Unfortunately, the text that eventually came out of SB58 and will be carried forward to COP doesn't include that level of detail on metrics of any type, not only metrics on health, but having that preliminary text there that we can refer back to from midway through the negotiations really gives us something to build on. You asked too about Health Day, and I think Health Day is such a tremendous opportunity that's offered by COP28 for the health community to raise the profile of how health and climate change are so deeply intertwined. And Health Day will present such a key opportunity for events that can amplify that message. I think it's also really important to think about health in the negotiations themselves, because Health Day will provide a great opportunity for conversations, but we also want actions, and we know that actions only come and when there's been a commitment to do so. So we need those healthy climate commitments in negotiation text, and then we need accountability mechanisms for them to be implemented. So a twin track approach of compelling arguments and narratives and conversations, and seeing that in the policy outcomes too. Because we know that if we come out of COP28 again with no agreement on mitigation, so what we didn't get when we came out of Bonn, that the health threat of climate change will continue to increase, because we'll see worse and worse climate threats and therefore worse and worse health impacts. But we also won't be maximizing health benefits, for example, of fossil fuel phase out.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Jess. And certainly all of us, or many of us, are experiencing those effects right now with heat waves and floods and really stressing weather patterns coming around us in the last few weeks. I wanted to talk a little bit about fossil fuels, because you did mention that, and we know that just transition is an important topic, and something that's coming up certainly in the negotiations and in the work from SB58 and on towards the road to COP28. And at Healthcare Without Harm, we are very much an advocate for integrating that health argument into the vision of a just transition that promotes equity and addresses those health impacts of fossil fuels. Was this topic you felt well covered during SB58, and what were the key takeaways from the discussions? Nova?
Yeah, so I followed Just Transition as well, and the main thing that was talked about was this Just Transition work program, which was created at COP27, and so at SB58, the bulk of these sessions, we're trying to find, the scope of what that work program is going to look like, objectives, how are they going to do it, essentially. So a lot of that discussion was what should be included in a just transition. And I'd say a lot of what parties talked about was including the workforce within the just transition, which I think is pretty agreed upon. But there are also some debate whether or not it should just be workforce, or if it should be more general and kind of sector-wide or economy-wide. And there was also a lot of, you mentioned fossil fuels. There was also a lot of debate whether or not to include fossil fuels in this work program, to include, fossil fuel phase out or phase down, or, any of the other kind of a weird language there. But there did seem to be debate about that, and also maybe not even mentioning sources at all. So from a health perspective, that is obviously not what we want to happen, but that is what was talked about a bit. I think in terms of the just transition, health, we need to do a lot more work to get health into that narrative. I don't think there was really at any point the mention of health within these work program negotiations. So I think that's something that we as a health community can definitely build upon, and I think we have a lot of resources like Healthcare Without Harm to help push that. But I think there's a long way to go in terms of health within the just transition.
Thank you, Nova. Thank you for that. And yeah, so this is one of the areas that we want to focus our attention to at COP28. And so I wanted to ask Jess, as we are moving towards our big planning for COP28, which I know it's in December, but it takes quite a bit of work. What challenges and opportunities do you feel the health sector needs to address in the preparation for COP28? What should we consider and to keep in mind as we approach the conference?
Thanks so much, Diana. I think as the health community prepares for COP28, it's really crucial that to consider how, if we want a healthy outcome, we really need to think about how health relates to the different pillars of climate action. And these can broadly be grouped into mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, and then finance to underpin action across all of those three areas. So if we think of health and climate change like a three-legged stool, if we don't have one of those legs of the stool, mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, then the stool will fall over. Loss and damage is such a crucial aspect to be emphasizing for so many reasons, but not least because it provides such a compelling narrative and humanizes the effects of climate change around the world. And the more that we can be integrating those stories of people into our communications and elevating those, the more clear it will be how vital climate action is for health. The other two pillars that I just mentioned are mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation is essential for slowing the progression of climate change, and adaptation is the best that we can do to respond to those threats so that we don't see losses and damages. We know that adaptation is urgent and vital in so much of the world right now because we're seeing climate threats and we need to be able to respond to them. At the same time, if we don't also immediately mitigate, those limits of adaptation will be very rapidly exceeded, and that will be catastrophic for human health. So we can never have mitigation or adaptation. We need both, and we need both immediately. We know that fossil fuel phase out is going to be a particularly contentious issue at COP28, and the health community can really add constructive arguments to the space in terms of thinking about how fossil fuels are not only the main driver of climate change itself and therefore of health impacts that result from climate change, but also the health impacts of air pollution from fossil fuel combustion, the health impacts from air, water and soil pollution from fossil fuel extraction and processing, and the health risks for workers that work in fossil fuel extraction. So if as a health professional or a member of the wider health community, you feel able to be vocal on those issues in the lead up to COP28, then we would urge you to use your voice. And we would also love to hear from you and for you to get in touch with GCHA. Equally, if you'd like to work on the policy themes that will be negotiated in Dubai at COP28, then we'd really love to get in touch on that too, and would welcome you taking part in some of our preparatory work. And there'll be a link at the bottom of the screen that you are welcome to go to and sign up for our coordination on that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jess and Nova, for sharing your invaluable insights on SB58 and the efforts that you, Healthcare Without Harm, and other organizations are making to make sure that health stays at the center of the climate negotiations. I hope that we can continue to work collaboratively. And for those of you who are joining us in this session, if you want to get in touch with the Global Climate and Health Alliance, at the bottom of your screen, you can find the website to do so, as well as if you want to get in touch with us at Healthcare Without Harm, there is information at the bottom of your screen. Thank you again, Jess and Nova, and until next time.